everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is August the 5th, 2021. I'm Barry Stagner, and a couple of things before we jump in. Just a reminder to keep us in prayer about this weekend. It's the first of some awaiting his return conferences, much of which was canceled last year. Amir and I and others were scheduled to hit a lot of wonderful places around the world in this past year, Japan and Australia, and certainly places here in the United States. Really a crazy year to consider all the things that we've all endured. But things have opened up a bit, and now they're starting to turn the other direction. But we are going to be in Las Vegas, Nevada this Saturday from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at Calvary Chapel, Lone Mountain. Now, the event is full, but you can watch online. If you go to YouTube, you can watch at Calvary Chapel, Lone Mountain, and that's, I think it's CC Lone Mountain org, something like that. But anyway, just look up Calvary Chapel, Lone Mountain, and you can watch the conference from 9 a.m. until 5:30 p.m. I'll be kicking it off. I guess my scheduled speaking time is at 9:45, I believe. And then I'm not sure who will follow me, but Pastor Jimmy Morales will be speaking. Our dear and good friend, Pastor Mike Golay, who you often see on the Q&As as well as the roundtables, handling the questions as they're fed in. Then, of course, Amir will be speaking, and we'll do a panel Q&A session as well, as is typical of all the conferences. So once again, that's this Saturday, 9 a.m. at CC Lone Mountain on YouTube. And you can watch from there. And looking forward to meeting many of you who have emailed and said they will be at the conference or commented on social media that they're going to be in person at the conference, and looking forward to seeing you there. So with that said, it's been, as always, a pretty interesting week in the news. And we've talked about over the years on various programs that I've hosted and been a part of, the fact that prophecy kind of has an ebb and flow type cycle like the tides. It comes in and goes out and things escalate, then they slow down. And we seem to be in a pretty significant period of escalation, especially as it pertains to the Middle East. And I think this is important because what we have to recognize, and let me just say this as we jump in today, it kind of hit me as I've been studying Bible prophecy for many years, and I always look to the Olivet Discourse in places like Revelation, Ezekiel, latter portions of Daniel and Zechariah, and you see this mention of birth pangs that Jesus talked about in the beginning of sorrows, and Paul translated that same Greek word as labor pains on a pregnant woman when he wrote to the church at Thessaloniki regarding Bible prophecy. And it's interesting that if you really think about this, in comparison to the duration of a pregnancy, labor pains are a very, very short period of time. Now, that tells us things ought to escalate quickly and move directly into the heavy labor of the tribulation, and then finally giving birth to the millennial reign of Christ on earth. And it is possible when we see one of these pushes forward prophetically that we have jumped into or crossed or breached the bridge of the final escalation, the labor pains portion. Now, in Matthew 24:3-8, Jesus talked about normal course of life events. The one thing he indicated, there would be false Christ. Remembering Christ means anointing or anointed. Speaking specifically of the anointed one, he said, there'll be a lot of people in the last days who claim an anointing from me. And then in the Sermon on the Mount, he ended that with recognizing that many will say, Lord, Lord, but he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness. So we see false claims of anointing all around us. We see the wars and rumors of wars, the ethnic tensions Jesus mentioned. We see the famines growing around the world. We'll talk a little about that today. We also see the pestilence, and I think we all have become more familiar than we ever wanted to be with pestilence or plague. And then you see the cosmological and geographical events, geological events that are escalating as well throughout the course of history. But all of a sudden, there seems to be a pretty significant bump in things as far as their frequency and intensity. And could this be the final labor pains before the church is delivered and the Lord says to his bride, come up here? Well, we'll see in coming days. No man knows the day or the hour. We're not here to make predictions, foolish predictions, I would say, but we are here to examine the facts. We don't want to be caught like the Pharisees, whom Jesus rebuked and said, you guys can predict the weather, but you didn't even know it's time for me to come. You've ignored all the signs that I am the Messiah, and you're completely unaware that this is what the prophets wrote of and was long foretold about me. So we don't want to be caught in that position. So let's take a look at some of the things happening first in the Middle East, and we'll talk about some of the mentality that's continuing to escalate and dominate the world scene today. Our first story comes from the Bloomberg report, and the headline reads, "Suspected ship hijack ends as tensions with Iran soar." A suspected hijacking of a vessel near Iran has ended after stoking tensions already inflamed by a deadly drone attack on an Israeli-managed tanker in the same area. The Panama-flagged Asphalt Princess was briefly boarded by armed men on Tuesday, halfway between Iran and the UAE in the Gulf of Oman, according to a Gulf government official. The men then left the vessel around midnight local time, the official said, and Bloomberg News was unable to contact the ship's Dubai-based owner or operator to confirm the information. However, Saeed Kazbadzadeh, spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry, denied that Iran's forces boarded ships in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman and warned against rumors and the fake news of the Western and Zionist media. The U.S. and its allies have also blamed Iran for last week's drone attack, which caused frictions to soar in and around the waterways of the Persian Gulf that carry many of the world's exports. The U.S. has vowed a collective response to that strike, which killed a Romanian and a Briton. Israel said military action may be needed. Now, this is interesting if you pair it with our next story, and we know that there was a election in Iran not too long ago, and the United Press International is reporting that Ibrahim Raisi takes office as Iran's president, vows to fight U.S. sanctions. Iran's next president, Ibrahim Raisi, was formally endorsed on Tuesday by Iranian religious leader Ali Khamenei and took office during a ceremony in Tehran. Raisi, during the ceremony, promised to take actions to lift cruel sanctions imposed by the United States and said he would not tie the country's future with the West. As Iran's eighth president, he also noted that he plans to continue talks with world powers concerning the 2015 nuclear deal. He succeeds Hassan Rouhani, who has led the Islamic nation since 2013. And Raisi, 60, also spoke about comprehensive economic and health plans to help lift Iran from the crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. He also pledged to fight corruption and restore people's trust in government. Yeah, that's the way to do it, through a phony election. Raisi's formal inauguration is scheduled for Thursday. More than 100 officials from 73 countries will attend his inauguration ceremony, including the EU's top representative in the nuclear talks, Enrique Mora. And Raisi is on the U.S. sanctions list for serial human rights violations after openly boasting his role as a member of the Death Commission, which oversaw 30,000 political prisoners' deaths in 1988. Most of those executed, including teenagers and pregnant women, were supporters of the main opposition, Mojahedin al-Khalid. Now, we've had a change in administration, and we've been talking about this, about the biblically implied unrest at the high-level positions of authority around the world that caused the world to proclaim their desire, their demand really for peace and security, and then suddenly destruction is going to come upon them, as we know the Bible foretells. But here you've got a more aggressive position. Hassan Rouhani was considered a moderate, and though he was part of the Islamic regime there, the state that is run as a theocracy, with Allah being in charge and Ali Khamenei being his proxy, so to speak, or representative. And now we've got one who is more extreme, more radical. And just to consider these things that he has said in comparison with his actions, he wants to restore trust in the government after being part and parcel in killing a massacre of over 30,000 political prisoners. Yeah, I'm sure he's got the people's trust already, but that's really not their goal. Their goal is dominance, as is the case with many other leaders around the world. Now, he's more aggressive. We're seeing a lot of activity in the Persian Gulf. We're seeing some aggressive movements on the part of Iran, even though they, like most people in the region, will deny any involvement for their actions with this drone strike and elsewhere. But the interesting part about this is how it now leads into what we're going to talk about here for the next few moments. The Washington Examiner says they can't sit calmly in Tehran. Israel vows to retaliate against Iran if the U.S. won't. Israel will retaliate against an alleged Iranian attack on an oil tanker in the Arabian Sea and unilaterally, if need be, according to Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. They can't sit calmly in Tehran while igniting the entire Middle East. That's over, Bennett said Tuesday while meeting with military officials in northern Israel. We are working to enlist the whole world, but when the time comes, we know how to act alone. Bennett's statement, let me just pause there a moment. Zechariah 12, verse 3 says that's exactly how Jerusalem, which represents the nation of Israel, at least as far as the leadership, it's going to stand alone. It's going to be a burdensome stone to all nations. And Bennett is saying, we know how to act alone. His statement would seem to raise the likelihood of a high-profile clash between Israel and Iran, a development with domestic and diplomatic significance. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has pledged a collective response to the incident, which killed 2 civilians, as we mentioned in our previous story, one from the UK and another from Romania. We join allies in strongly condemning the recent fatal attack on the MV Mercer Street off the coast of Oman and express our condolences to Romania and the UK for the losses they have suffered, a NATO spokesman said on Tuesday. Freedom of navigation is vital for all NATO allies and must be upheld in accordance with international law. The UK, the United States, and Romania have concluded Iran is highly likely responsible for this incident. Allies remain concerned by Iran's destabilizing actions in the region and call on Tehran to respect its international obligations. Now, there's a multitude of things in that story that we could highlight. And the last phrase, I think, is important: international obligations. The world is moving, as we talk about frequently, the world is moving towards that global governance system that's going to be headed up by the Antichrist. And, you know, interesting, somebody sent me an email after, I think, last week's or a week before's lineup stating that the Antichrist will not rule the whole world. Well, that's not what Revelation 13 says. Revelation 13 says the whole world is going to go after the beast. They are going to follow him. He is going to be the dominant political factor in the world during the tribulation. There's going to be an entire geopolitical shakeup when he comes to power. Not going to be a China. There's not going to be a Russia. There's going to be a divided group of nations under the authority of those whom he assigns as his cronies, a 10-king federation, 3 of whom he will destroy. But make no mistake, he is going to rule the world, and this is what Satan has been after for a long time. Now, but we also see the fact that there are mentions in this story, not just about international law, but also a collective response. So you've got this movement toward acting internationally, militarily. So that would, again, require a coalition that's beyond simply a NATO type status. You know, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Has to be a global coalition of forces, and it needs somebody to lead it. And, you know, this growing mistrust in government is happening all over the world. The people versus the politicians seems to be a growing trend. You've got major problems in Lebanon. We'll talk a little about that. You've got growing unrest in Iran. You've got basically a war going on between citizens and politicians in Australia. With these mandates that are being enforced on them. We've got a story about that coming up as well. You've got a movement forward here in the United States. where, the pandemic, real as it is, and truth be told, there are people who are sick and have died and all of that, but there's no question it's being used by those in places of power to advance their agenda. And just there is this growing divide between the people and politics. And the interesting thing is you've got these collective groups that are running different countries, whether it be a parliamentary system or a democracy or a republic, where there's representation of the people in places of power in whatever the capital city may be or their headquarters may be. And what really I think the world is tiring of is these collective groups becoming corrupt and basically, not doing what they're hired to do, so to speak. I know the Congress, the trust level of Congress here in the United States is at an all-time low. People have never trusted the government less than they do right now here in the United States. So what's the solution? Well, if you can't find a collective group of people who can rule fairly and justly, then there has to be just one guy who rises up and handles all the world's problems. And we are headed there. There's no question about that. But let me remind you, as I always do, we're not going to be here. The great escape precedes the great tribulation. We do not have an appointment with wrath. And who knows what we're going to see develop in the Middle East. Lots of talk about the Isaiah 17 prophecy, Damascus becoming a ruinous heap. And are we going to see that? It's possible we might. Could be the catalyst for launching the Ezekiel war scenario. I personally believe because of the divine response and the very defend Israel type response that's going to take place during the tribulation period, when God rains down fire from heaven and there's a great earthquake and hailstones and flooding rain and all that. It's clearly a divine response. That's more consistent with during the tribulation than prior to the tribulation. But it doesn't mean the Ezekiel war cannot start before the tribulation. Nothing says it's going to happen as fast as you can read those 2 chapters. It could take some years to launch the initial invasion and there be initial attacks. But the end result we do know, and it is going to be quick and succinct, and that is God is going to gain the day and the victory. So again, we're moving in this direction. And this story, I think, is important because it highlights for us that you need a radical in position, especially in Iran. You've already got one in in Turkey, who again wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. Erdogan desires to be sultan over this empire. Here you've got the same type of mentality with the Iranians. They want to establish a global caliphate. And with obviously the Shias in charge, and Erdogan sees it differently. But you've got extremists on the joystick, so to speak, of the power control in these 2 countries who are named players in the Ezekiel war scenario. Now, in response to what Bennett said, Israel Hayom repeats that Iran threatens strong response to any attack. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman decries baseless accusations that Iran was behind the drone attack on Israeli-managed vessel in the Gulf of Oman on Friday. Iran will respond promptly to any threat against its security, a foreign ministry spokesman said on Monday, as the U.S., Israel, and Britain blamed Tehran for an attack on an Israeli-managed tanker off the coast of Oman. The Islamic Republic of Iran has no hesitation in protecting its security and national interests and will respond promptly and strongly to any possible adventure, state television quoted Saeed Khalilzadeh as saying. Sorry, these multi-syllable names where consonants are next to each other, where they normally wouldn't be in the English language, can be a bit cumbersome. Strongly regretted the baseless accusations made by British Foreign Secretary against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which were repeated by the U.S. Secretary of State in the same context and contained contradictory, false, and provocative accusations, he went on to say. Although Iran considers the threats of Western officials and the Zionist regime or Israel to be more of a propaganda gesture, any action against Iran's national interests and security will be met with a strong and decisive response, an unnamed official told NOR news agency on Monday. Now, again, remember, you've got a different personality at the helm. You've got someone who's not afraid to execute the political opposition party members and dissidents within the country. And, so now you've got someone who's a little more aggressive, and you can put a little more strength behind his statements than just the propaganda he accuses the U.S. and Great Britain of. So tensions are rising in the Middle East. And you've got now some military activity, even though it's related to the Gulf of Oman controlling, this particular area of the world. The main channel, as one of the earlier articles said, of flow of oil out from the Middle East into the rest of the world. And certainly that is a factor in this. But again, you've got someone who's more extreme at the control in Iran now. And one of these times, this is going to escalate well beyond what we've seen in the past, the ebb and flow thing I mentioned before. Israel's got trouble on the other side of its northern border, not just in Syria with the presence of the Iranians, the Russians and the Turkish military, as well as others who are there fighting for their particular outcome, desired outcome of the Syrian civil war. But on the other side, missiles fired from Lebanon into Israel, and the IDF responds with artillery fire. Color red sirens sounded in northern Israel as 3 rockets were fired at Israel from Lebanon on Wednesday afternoon. 2 rockets crossed the border, landing inside Israeli territory, while the third remained inside Lebanon. 4 Israelis were treated for shock, and the rockets ignited a fire in a field adjacent to the city of Kiryat Shimona. The mayor of Kiryat Shimona instructed residents to remain close to bomb shelters until further notice. The IDF responded with artillery fire targeting Hezbollah military targets inside Lebanon, and the Hezbollah-affiliated Al-Manar television station reported that the IDF fired 6 shells toward areas surrounding the town of Qaim. Media reports citing IDF officials suggested that Palestinian factions inside Lebanon may have been responsible for the rocket fire. It is unlikely that a Palestinian group would be able to operate inside Lebanon without consent or without coordinating with Hezbollah. So again, you've got trouble on the northern border, of Israel, the very direction that the invasion will come from. It is interesting, though, with all that we've seen, the 2006 Lebanon War and other battles and wars and skirmishes in between over the years, that Lebanon is not a named player in the Ezekiel war scenario. We'll talk more about that in a few moments as to why. Now, the Israel National News, or Eretz Sheva, is reporting Defense Minister Gantz says Iran is 10 weeks away from being capable of a nuclear weapon. On Wednesday morning, Defense Minister Benny Gantz, the Blue and White Party, and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid issued a joint statement following a briefing of ambassadors at the Foreign Ministry. Gantz and Lapid hosted ambassadors of the UN Security Council member countries for a briefing held at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The briefing is part of the State of Israel's national effort to call on the international community to condemn and stop Iranian terror and aggression in the region. During the past week, Israel has acted in all possible diplomatic and security channels in order to call on the international community to set clear boundaries for Iran and to cease its aggressive conduct. Gantz and Lapid emphasized to the ambassadors that Israel will maintain the right to act independently in the face of any attack or threat to its citizens and sovereignty. They further stressed that recent attacks are not part of a local or bilateral conflict, but rather an attack on the international community, and that community should treat it as such and respond. Now, Iran is once again, the article says, proven to be a global challenge, a regional challenge, and also a challenge to the state of Israel. Iran is responsible for dozens of terror attacks across the Middle East while controlling its proxies in Yemen, Iraq, and additional countries. The article goes on to say Iran has violated all the guidelines set in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iranian Deal, and it's only 10 weeks away from acquiring weapons-grade materials necessary for a nuclear weapon. Now is the time for deeds. Words are not enough. It is time for diplomatic, economic, and even military deeds. Otherwise, the attacks will continue. Gantz also emphasized, this is important, the Iranian people are not our enemy. The Iranian regime is threatening us and sparking a regional arms race. Now, we've talked about this before, and this isn't something that's part of our breakfast conversation or dinner conversation. But the process of separating the isotopes U-238 and U-235 are basically simplistic, at least in concept, and it's just a matter of time. And continually separating these two isotopes, the fissile from the non-fissile, creates a density necessary of at least 90% in order to create a weapon. And so just quietly continuing to enrich uranium is what's been going on under the auspices of, creating nuclear power for the country in Iran. Well, listen, nuclear power, enriched uranium only has to be enriched to 20% in order to be used for nuclear power. Once you start breaching the 85 and 90% concentration, then you've got a weapons grade enriched uranium, which there's only one use for it, and that is to militarize that and or weaponize that. And they've been working on their intercontinental ballistic missile program. So, Israel has reason for concern. Now, again, this comment that they're just 10 weeks away tells us, as throughout the tenure of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said over and over and over, we will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And now Gantz has come out and said they're about 10 weeks away from having that possibility. Now, does that mean that Israel is going to act? Well, very possibly. They have acted in other ways to slow this process. A few weeks ago, they took out a factory that makes the blades that are placed inside centrifuges, since Iran can't buy those out on the open market because of the sanctions. But so they were building their own, and Israel took out that factory that manufactures that. Now, again, how much enriched uranium they'll have at level 90% military weapons grade in 10 weeks, will it be enough to make a bomb? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact is that will put them even closer, days or just a couple of weeks away from accumulating enough to make a warhead and then send that in Israel's direction. So, as I said, we just don't know exactly what is going to be the catalyst that launches that powder keg in the Middle East. And, the Isaiah 17 thing is hanging out there and things we mentioned a moment ago. But we are in a period of escalation. Now, things could slow down as they have over the years. But as I said, one of these times, it's going to be it. One of these days, we're going to wake up and we're going to have a moment and twinkling of an eye experience and forever be with the Lord. And the world is going to be launched into a time like it's never seen since men were on the face of the earth. Now, another troubling story. We know the Bible says clearly that in the last days, there'll be an increase in anti-Semitism. And this is a sad story, our next two, actually, because they involve my own home country and many of you as well. And Jihad Watch is reporting in New York City, Palestinian jihad supporters scream, globalize the Intifada. We don't want two states. Intifada means uprising. We want all of it. Did you catch that? We don't want two states. We want all of it. What are they talking about? Two-state solution only applies to one country in the world, and that's the nation of Israel. This would require the total destruction of Israel and the genocide of millions of Jews. Meanwhile, the call to globalize the Intifada heralds more violence against Jews worldwide. The summary of the article concludes. Several hundred protesters took part in a pro-Palestinian rally Saturday in Brooklyn using inflammatory rhetoric and messaging against Israel. They lauded Intifada uprisings and called for taking control of Israeli territory, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. During the protest, organized by an organization called Within Our Lifetime United for Palestine, demonstrators marched behind three large banners: globalize the Intifada, Zionism is terrorism, and we will free Palestine within our lifetime. And Intifada, again, is an Arabic word meaning uprising or rebellion. And during the second Intifada from 2000 to 2005, Palestinian terror groups, including Hamas, Palestinian and Islamic Jihad, and some affiliated with Fatah, carried out hundreds of terrorist attacks against Israeli citizens and security personnel, killing more than 1,000. And during Saturday's rallies, marchers chanted, "We don't want no two states. We want all of it," referring to the two-state solution that has formed the basis of peace proposals. Then a little closer to my home here in Southern California, Israel 365 is reporting that pro-Palestinian counter-protesters in San Diego call for the destruction of Israel. It's just hard to believe that this is going on in the United States of America. Well, it's kind of hard to believe, but with the way things have been going lately, I guess it's not that hard after all. A pro-Palestinian protest countering the multi-faith rally against anti-Semitism showed its true colors by calling for the annihilation of the Jewish state. 9 days ago, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo joined with Larry Elder, a candidate for governor. Please pray for California. One of the things that a bit comical but sad that I've heard different places around the country, our country that I've spoken in particular. I don't think people all realize the dynamics of the statement in other countries, but I've heard it consistently when I tell people I'm a native Californian. I was born in Orange County, California. I love California. California is my home. And I've been asked time and time again, how can you love California? Well, it's a great state. I love it here. I don't like our administration. Please pray for the recall efforts against Newsom. And let's get somebody in there who has our best interests at heart, not advancing their agenda. Anyway, 9 days ago, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo joined with Larry Elder, a candidate for governor, and local faith leaders to hold a We Are Israel rally denouncing anti-Semitism and uniting people together for freedom and democracy. Because the number of anti-Semitic attacks has never been this high in the U.S., Jew hatred seems to have no consequences. We deserve to go to a restaurant without being harassed for being a Jew. We deserve to be protected by law the same way as any other minority group, stated the event website. Shield of David, the rally's organizer, noted that a survey of American Jewish people conducted by the Anti-Defamation League this year found that in the past 5 years, 63% had experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism. That figure was up from 54% in 2020. The deadly shooting at San Diego's Poway Synagogue in 2019 left a stain of anti-Semitism on the community that organizers are trying to cope with. There have been few experiences in my life as moving as the first trip that I took to Israel, Pompeo said at the event. It is because I am a Christian and an American that I was proud to lead the fight for the defense of Israel, the Jewish people, and the perennial cause of religious liberty around the world. Now, ironically, pro-Palestinian groups carried signs saying, "Down with racism and Zionism." Down with racism, right. Here they are making racist declarations, seeking the demise of a racial people group, and yet they're saying down with racism. And again, Janine Erekat with the San Diego chapter of the Palestinian Youth Movement defined the event protesting anti-Semitism as anti-Muslim, claiming that former President Donald Trump was anti-Semitic. You remember the guy with the Jewish son-in-law whose own daughter converted to Judaism, and the one who moved the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv into the eternal capital of Israel, Jerusalem. You mean that guy? That's the anti-Semitic guy? Boy, we need to pray for our country and our young people in particular. Now, we mentioned Lebanon a few moments ago, and sad stories are continuing to develop out of Lebanon, and this comes from the Associated Press. On the Beirut blast anniversary, Jordan warns Lebanon crisis could spill over beyond its borders. King Abdullah urges properly coordinated international actions as international conference led by France and the UN raises $357 million in aid funds. And Jordan's King Abdullah warned on Wednesday that Lebanon's economic and political crisis could spill over beyond the country's borders without international support. And speaking at an international donor conference 1 year after the massive explosion at Beirut's port, Abdullah said, according to a transcript of his remarks published by the Jordanian state media, "We cannot sit back and leave Lebanon and its people edge over closer to the brink." He warned that without properly coordinating international actions, the ramifications of the crisis in Lebanon could reverberate across the region and well beyond it. The French presidency said the international conference has gathered over $357 million in aid required to meet Lebanon's humanitarian needs. And Wednesday's virtual conference, co-hosted by France and the UN, was meant to show support for the Lebanese people, French President Emmanuel Macron said. France will provide 100 million euros or $118.6 million in the coming months. President Joe Biden, who addressed the conference in a video message, pledged to give $100 million in new humanitarian assistance. About 40 heads of state and government, diplomats, and heads of international organizations have taken part in the conference, according to Macron's office. And participants included Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, King Abdullah II, and European Council President Charles Michel. Lebanon's current humanitarian needs have been estimated by the UN to be at least $357 million. Aid will focus on food, schools, the health sector, and clean water supply. Now, this is interesting because in the Middle East, obviously, there's temperatures are different than most other places in the world, and it's not a good place to have a water crisis. And yet here you've got protests in Iran over water shortages. You've got severe water shortages in Iraq. You've got this going on throughout the Middle East. You've had some pretty significant temperatures going on in Israel as well. And we know that the world is headed towards a time where these things are going to begin to have an impact, or they're going to have a major impact under the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the famine that takes place there. A quart of barley or wheat, basically a loaf of bread, is going to cost an entire day laborer's pay for a whole day's work. So things are moving in that direction rather interestingly. And now you've got just a basic human necessity like water is now a precious commodity in so many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. Interesting, the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies has an article titled "The New Blood Libel of Medical Apartheid." A vicious lie has been making the rounds lately. It is a time worm smear against the Jewish people in a modern guise. The ancient blood libel, Jews are poisoners, stoked anti-Semitic violence through the ages, from the Black Death to tainted wells. This time, it has taken the form of a claim that Israel is denying COVID-19 vaccinations to its non-Jewish citizens and to the residents of the not yet sovereign Palestinian Authority. This is as much a lie as all of its predecessors. The slander that Israel is denying COVID-19 vaccinations to both its non-Jewish citizens and residents of the Palestinian Authority is being widely decimated by Israel's enemies, especially on college campuses. On March 2nd of 2021, the Palestine Solidarity Committee held a teach-in at the University of Texas in Austin, alleging medical apartheid not only in Israel's COVID response, but in the ability of the pregnant Palestinian women to access hospitals, which they claim has led to roadside deaths related to childbirth. Also in March 2021, Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, Chicago, held a 3-day campaign called End Medical Apartheid, alleging that Israel denies Palestinians proper health treatment, drawing parallels to healthcare inequities for non-white Chicagoans. Likewise, SJP at the University of Maryland held an open Zoom call to advance the claim of medical apartheid. Now, again, looking at the Arab population, which numbers over 2 million in Israel, the Israeli Arabs, those who live within the boundaries of Israel in the Arab communities, enjoy a freedom that's not available to Jews in these Muslim countries or Arab countries. And, there's been no holding back of the vaccine from anybody. All of the citizens within the country have been given access to it. And yet this demand is so bizarre, and this accusation is so bizarre, because you've got the Gaza Strip that has its own hospitals. Multiple stories reported every single year about how Jewish hospitals are treating Palestinian victims of whatever it may be, or advanced medical conditions that require state-of-the-art technology and all that. And yet, something supposedly they're denying just the simple giving birth to a Palestinian woman inside the comforts of a hospital is being imposed upon them by the Jewish people, which is simply not true. There's hospitals in the Gaza Strip, and there's ways for people to get to those places. The problem is, one, the ignorance of these people making this statement of the fact that, there are billions and billions of dollars that have been poured into the Gaza Strip, more than enough to take care of all the humanitarian needs, but all that money goes to building big fat houses for Hamas leaders and financing the building of tunnels and attacks on Israel. Instead of going to where the money was intended to go, they're using it to advance their cause. That's where the apartheid is. It's not within the boundaries of Israel. If you're not familiar with who Brigitte Gabriel is, you should check out her story as a Lebanese woman and how she learned differently about who the Jews really are by that very scenario they're being accused of. Now, here's an interesting story. In Australia, met many wonderful people there, love it and enjoy it, and they are a beautiful country, and they're going through it down there as well as the rest of the world. American military news reports that Australia deploys helicopters, hundreds of troops to keep people at home and strict new lockdowns in Sydney. Around 300 Australian Defence Force soldiers were deployed alongside police over the weekend in New South Wales to help police enforce strict new coronavirus lockdowns. Police helicopters have also been seen in the area, ordering residents to comply with lockdown restrictions. Australian broadcaster ABC reported the soldiers arrived in the city of Sydney over the weekend and underwent training and would begin going door to door in Sydney by Monday to check that residents are complying with the lockdown orders. The Daily Mail reported in Sydney's western suburbs, residents saw police helicopters hovering overhead while sounding sirens and broadcasting the message, "This is public health order. Do not break the rules. You will be found and fines issued." The arrival of ADF troops and other enforcement measures comes more than a month after the New South Wales government ordered new coronavirus restrictions on June 23rd. The lockdowns in Sydney have again been extended until at least August 28th. The lockdown rules include a mask mandate, even for some outdoor places. People may leave their homes to get groceries or medicine or go to the hospitals. Only one person per household is permitted to leave their home per day to get groceries. People are allowed to go to work or school only if they cannot work and study from home. People may go outdoors to exercise, but are not allowed to travel more than 10 kilometers from their home, which is about 6 miles. Now, this is interesting. I happened to see a little video that popped up, or someone had sent me regarding a man who was being arrested by Australian police for not wearing a mask. And the man said, "I can't wear a mask. I've got a heart condition. This compromises my health." And very sadly, while being arrested, the man who refused to wear a mask for his own personal health reasons had a heart attack while he was being arrested. Now, thankfully, he did survive. But, again, this blanket approach to this is disrespectful, for one, illegal in most countries that have a constitution such as what we have here in the United States. And it doesn't mean that people are uncaring about other people's health. There are legitimate reasons for people to avoid the vaccine. There are legitimate reasons for people to avoid wearing a mask. And there are some people that is not healthy for. And that's to say nothing of the multitudes of reports that we have seen that masks do nothing to keep out the microbes of the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. So all that aside, again, what we're seeing is the preparation of the world for global mandates that everyone must bow to or face the consequences. We know what that consequence is going to be during the tribulation period. Anyone who doesn't take the mark of the beast or the number of his name on their hand or forehead is going to be killed. And for those who believe in Jesus, beheading will be the means by which their lives are taken. Now, the National Pulse reports this story. Scientific journal paper suggests making it a federal hate crime, get this, to criticize Dr. Fauci. That's right. A scientific journal suggests making it a federal hate crime to criticize Dr. Fauci. You mean the Dr. Fauci that said masks don't work? Dr. Fauci that said everybody has to wear a mask? And Dr. Fauci, who's reported multiple things that contradict the previous statement time and time again. Yeah, it's unbelievable what's going on in the scientific community as well as the political theater. A scientific journal article authored by Professor Peter Hotez a frequent guest on corporate media networks, called to extend federal hate crime protections for scientists facing criticism from alleged far-right extremists, including National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Director Anthony Fauci. Dr. Hotez, who himself has been funded by Anthony Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1993, offered the robust defense of scientists, including Fauci and EcoHealth Alliance President Peter Daszak, in a recent paper, Mounting Anti-Science Aggression in the United States. And he said, there is a troubling new expansion of anti-science aggression in the U.S. It's arising from far-right extremism. The paper, published in peer-reviewed Public Library of Science Biology Journal, begins. A band of ultra-conservative members of the U.S. Congress and other public officials with far-right leanings are waging organized and seemingly well-coordinated attacks against prominent U.S. biological scientists. In parallel, conservative news outlets repeatedly and purposely promote disinformation designed to portray key American scientists as enemies, it reiterates. Now, think about these statements. A hate crime to speak out your opinion. Even if your opinion is wrong, you have the right to state your opinion. But we live in the age of safe places and where people can have their feelings hurt or their ideas challenged peacefully, and even though aggressively, peacefully. But this is where we're going. The thought police are now trying to take control and get us to a place where the world will be ready to bow to that man. And as Paul said in his letter to the Thessalonians, that there is coming a time where people will be so deluded they will believe the lie. Now, again, as I've said time and again, COVID-19 is real. We've had people in our church die from it. We've got people in our church in ICU from it. And there's no question about that as to whether it's real or not. But what's also real is that the CDC themselves reports that it has a 99.6% survival rate. So yes, it's tragic. Every loss of life is tragic, and nobody is denying that. But why, when something has a 0.6% survival rate, are vaccines being mandated? Shouldn't it be a health choice, and shouldn't that be a personal choice? And, looking at these things and how they're advancing, and now these accusations that you're anti-science, if you have a legitimate reason, maybe for not taking a vaccine, and there are people who do have legitimate medical reasons. If you've got an immunodisorder where your immune system is overactive, the science says that taking the vaccine could compromise your health and even be fatal if you've got certain pre-existing conditions. So, this just blanket effort to say everybody has to have it, and if you don't, you're anti-science, you're an enemy, is just ridiculous. But yet, this is where our world is going. Now, this is another reality of the days in which we live, and it comes from Breitbart. De Blasio brags about cutting off unvaccinated from everyday activities. People must see vaccination as literally necessary to living a good life. And New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a Key to NYC Pass initiative on Tuesday, a vaccine passport program barring unvaccinated individuals from entering gyms, restaurants, and entertainment venues in the Big Apple. And he warned that it is time for Americans to view getting vaccinated as literally necessary to living a good, full, and healthy life. Proudly presenting it as a first-in-the-nation program, de Blasio expressed hope it will force the unvaccinated to take action to get the jab, as they will effectively cut off from many everyday life activities in the city. The thing that's troubling about this, and let me just clarify something. Personally, I've had COVID. I get tested every 60 days for antibodies. And my wife, the same thing. We're running the same level of antibodies in our bodies by getting them naturally through having COVID as people who are getting the vaccination. How many articles do we see today about the strength of natural antibodies? None. It's get the jab, get the jab, get the jab. You have to get the jab. And again, it may be that at the heart of it, for many, and I believe it is, for many, is the protection of the health of the people of their country. But why not publicly recognize? And I just heard yesterday that actually there is a police department, one of the largest in our country, who, if anyone can, from their doctor, present evidence that they've acquired antibodies naturally, that's a pass as well. They can keep working and go into any establishment because it's equal to getting the vaccine, so to speak. So, but there's no mention of this. It's, again, the control mechanism that's being used to prepare the world for the man of sin. Now, the American Spectator reports tyranny has returned to the U.S., this time by proxy. A hallmark of tyranny is the unequal application of justice. In 1776, the newly minted Americans declared their unequivocal rejection of government tyranny. Back then, tyranny was simple and direct. Today, it's not. Tyranny describes cruel, unreasonable, or arbitrary use of power or control. And under 18th century British rule, control was applied directly. Aristocrats decreed and government officials, bureaucrats, police, and military enforced their decrees. The rule of law was arbitrary, applied unevenly, depending on class, social position, and wealth. Today, Americans are tyrannized by their own professional political ruling class indirectly. Rather than passing unconstitutional laws, federal politicians hold press conferences, make pronouncements, and generate advisories or guidelines. Under the threat of being canceled, private citizens implement these guidelines, becoming agents or proxies of the federal government. Their tyranny involves all aspects of American life: healthcare, communication, a marketplace, the court system, border control, education, work, and recreation. When COVID struck, Washington imposed martial law indirectly. People were locked down, prevented from travel or assembly, were not allowed to work. Free speech was curtailed, as was the free exercise of religion. Americans no longer had their Bill of Rights. Now, we've talked about this already, so I don't want to spend too much time on that as our moments are running short. But let's end up with a couple of things. One, piece of good news. I think this is interesting, and we need to report on these kind of things as well. And this comes from the Times of Israel. Archaeologists unearthed first Jerusalem evidence of quake from Bible's Book of Amos. 8th century BCE, or before the Common Era tremblers, recorded by the biblical prophet, get new proof from current excavations in the city of David. Scholars hope it will help them crack the city's timeline. The multi-year coronavirus pandemic is now firmly branded as a benchmark in modern memory. Likewise, in the first verse of the book of Amos, the 8th century BCE biblical prophet referred to 2 years before the earthquake as an anchor to the events he was about to relate. 2 centuries later, the prophet Zechariah again referred to this destructive earthquake period, so deeply was it ingrained in the collective psyche. Now, for the first time, a team of Israeli Antiquities Authority archaeologists in Jerusalem, city of David, report that they have found unprecedented concrete evidence of this 8th century BCE earthquake in the ancient capital. In an upcoming research paper, the archaeologists chart, for example, that in one particular 8th century BCE structure, the destruction layer did not show signs of fire, yet other factors suggested the building had been damaged in a traumatic event, apparently an earthquake. This was most notable on the earliest floor of the southernmost room, they write. In this room, a row of smashed vessels was uncovered along its northern wall, above which fallen stones had been found. It appears these stones were part of the upper walls of the room, which had collapsed, destroying the vessels which had been set along the wall. Now, again, this should encourage us as Bible-believing Christians, because the fact is, the Bible's not a history book, but its history is accurate. The Bible's not a science book, but its science is accurate. Whatever it states is accurate and can be observed and is testable and provable. Same is true of claims the Bible makes regarding history. If it says there was a battle in a certain place between two certain groups 3,500 years ago, you can go to that place and find evidence of that. Just like this Zechariah and Amos mention of an earthquake. Now we have evidence that reminds us once again the information in the Bible is accurate. It is true. It is a book that records history accurately. It also records the future accurately. And therefore, we can be assured that all the things that we're talking about, all the things that we have seen coming to pass, are going to reach their ultimate fulfillment. There is going to be a rapture of the church. There is going to be a great tribulation. There is going to be a millennial reign of Christ on earth. There is going to be a great white throne judgment. And there is going to be an eternity where the two groups depending upon their position regarding the person of Christ, are going to meet their destinies. And thankfully, whosoever will may come. We need to be telling people about Jesus in these last days. He's the only one that can save them. Goodness sake, don't tell people about your political affiliations. Tell them about your Savior. Your political party can't do anything for anybody's soul. It's only Jesus that can save the human soul. And one last mention, and I did this last week, and I think it kind of put things in perspective, and I want to make mention again of the fact that the Bible talks about, we talked a lot about the number of volcanoes happening, and we would expect to see, if we're in that push, that final segment of the pregnancy period, labor has begun. We would expect to see things like this. Not saying that this is it, but I'm saying we would expect to hear headlines like this. And I'm going to read a handful of headlines to you like I did last week. More than 1,000 earthquakes rocked Yellowstone National Park in July, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. Brewing tropical storm could impact Japan during the final week of Tokyo Summer Olympics. Nothing abnormal, but it just is worthy of mention. Hurricane season to be busier than first thought, forecaster says. Floods are getting worse. The number of people exposed is 10 times higher than previously thought, a study finds. 16 killed by lightning on the way to a wedding party in Bangladesh. Brutal heat wave scorches southern Europe as continent's summer of extreme weather rages on. Record wildfires and heat sweep across Greece, threatening historic sites. We know the major fires that are burning in Turkey. Wildfires reach the outskirts of Athens, seriously damage or destroy more than 100 homes in Greece. We've got this under control. Firefighters continue to work Big Islands, Hawaii, largest fire for the 5th day. Next headline, California's largest wildfire just exploded, fanned by high winds and heat. The next headline says, in drought-plagued northern Mexico, tens of thousands of cows are starving to death. California imposes emergency ban on pumping water from Delta watershed, and massive melting event strikes Greenland after a record heat wave. And our final one is that cicadas invade the Olympics in place of cheering crowds. Now, again, if we're in the last days, and we definitely are, the Bible tells us in Hebrews that in these last days, the Father has spoken to us through His Son. So clearly we're in the last days, but are we in the last of the last days? I like to put it like this. People often talk about this as the beginning of the end. I think we're at the end of the beginning, and things are wrapping up, and soon we're going to be out of here and forever be with the Lord. And then there's going to be a massive great awakening on the earth, to be sure, but the means by which they arrive in heaven is not going to be quite as fun as being snatched off the earth in the twinkling of an eye, meeting the dead in Christ and forever being with the Lord. It's going to cost people their lives during the tribulation. So again, we need to be telling people about Jesus. But are we in the final push? Well, the one thing we know for sure is we could be. There are Jews in Jerusalem. Israel is the focal point of world attention. There are rising ethnic tensions going on around the world. Famine is rampant around the world and has long been, but is increasing, especially in light of some of these extreme weather conditions that we're seeing, and drought in some areas, flooding in others. Both bring about the same result. They destroy crops and food supplies and all of that. And now we've got this dissatisfaction with leadership around the world, and in almost the majority of the countries, if not the majority of the countries around the world. And you've got a world that's hungry for peace and security. So, the stage is being set. Jesus would come for us at any moment in time, and therefore we should always be looking up, for the redemption of these bodies is nigh. Well, that's it for this week. And again, I encourage you, hey, go to Telegram and subscribe to my channel there. I've been giving some different updates, trying to throw some information out there for you to glean throughout the week. So you can just search for my name. And please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel as well. And it's nonsense and sad how badly we're being restricted by big tech. But please go and subscribe to these places that will help us tremendously. The small percentage of people that social media allows to see our page is still a percentage. And the bigger the number of subscribers, the bigger the number of that percentage, even though the percentage itself may not change. So that's it for this week. Please be praying for us awaiting his return. Conference this weekend, Saturday morning from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., Calvary Chapel, Lone Mountain. Now, again, the event is full. You had to make a reservation, and it's full. So there's no in-person opportunity to go to this, but you can watch it from Calvary Lone Mountain's YouTube channel. So encourage you, go there, subscribe to theirs too. I know they'd appreciate some added subscriptions, and you can view the event there for free all day long. So once again, that's it for me. God bless you, and we'll see you next Thursday, Lord willing. Otherwise, we'll meet you here, there, or in the air.